At this point in your life, you've probably taken quite a few surveys, particularly along the realm of social media. So there are benefits and drawbacks to different survey techniques. And some of this relates to their benefits versus costs in terms of sampling bias and representation. So, for example, online surveys, the benefit, they're incredibly quick, they're very cost effective. The drawback, however, is that they are completely non random, and so there's an incredible degree of selection bias. If you send out an email to people asking them their opinions about X, you're only going to get a certain amount of responses from particular types of people who are going to respond to emails. Most of the time, emails go to the junk folder. So you're not necessarily going to get it representative of everybody who is in your target population. Hard copy, the benefit of this is that it is taken much more seriously. The drawback is that it's very time consuming. There's a locale needed, and it's also very costly. So to have someone there or to pay people to come in to take surveys can end up being quite expensive. Phone, this is taken even more seriously than hard copy, and another benefit is that you can ask follow-up, but this is the most cost prohibitive, and it's incredibly time consuming to do an entire survey over the phone. So you can understand why sometimes, just because the nature of research is the way it is, we don't have a whole lot of money to conduct research, so that means that we're going to have to do what we can. So we're going to do online where possible, and then part of the weakness of the study is it's going to be less representative. This should probably say instrument construction, but that just gives you an example of how we use survey and instrument somewhat interchangeably. But this begins with asking a sample of the population to respond to a prompt. So we're actually getting qualitative data to help us design a quantitative instrument. And then we use that to generate items or individual questions based on their responses. So in classes, typically I ask students to think back to a classroom experience you had that was very positive. How did your professor treat you? What was your communication like with that professor? And so if you just want to think about that for a minute, your responses, the descriptions that you provide are probably going to be very similar to the teacher confirmation scale, and that's exactly how the teacher confirmation scale was developed. So what individuals will do is they will gather that qualitative data, and they'll say, oh, this description keeps coming up over and over and over again. I wonder if that's really a measure of this phenomenon. So my instructor makes eye contact with me when I give responses. Many people said that over and over and over again. So we would generate an item. An item is just simply one of the questions on an instrument that says, my professor makes eye contact with me when I speak, and strongly agree to strongly disagree. And so that's how instruments are constructed. It's a very rigorous process. So it goes through testing on another sample of the population, and then there are lots of different statistical tests, which we're not going to do in this class, that tell you which items belong in the instrument and which items don't. They're not really helping you predict anything or helping you get to that final number that you want. That's a measure of the phenomenon. So this is what it would look like when we are moving from the sort of the more qualitative description into the item generation. So if we look at the paragraph description of your good communication scenario with your professor, I want you to take that and then list the traits or behaviors and then create statements based off of those traits or behaviors. So an example would be, my instructor listens to my responses to questions. It turns out that good listening is a part of teacher confirmation. So that's how those items then are generated, and then, as I said, those are then tested. No research is perfect. All research has questions. All research has costs and benefits that must be, decided. We've talked about a couple of those. So selection bias, if you're doing the way that you administer your survey is going to affect who participates. But we also have other things that happen within the survey itself. So there's self-report bias. So individuals tend to report what they believe to be more socially desirable than perhaps their true answer. So almost all of the time, individuals underreport the amount that they drink. They underreport other types of taboo or risky behaviors. So there's that kind of self-report bias. In some cases, we know the degree of self-report bias, so we can account for that. Sometimes we don't. There's also problems with question wording. So if individuals are just skimming and not really reading, then they may assume they know what the question is asking and they're not really paying attention. Also, you can have a double-barreled question, so you're really asking more than one thing within a question. My teacher is nice and kind. You aren't necessarily always nice and kind. Maybe you're nice, but not necessarily kind. It's really important that you make sure that each one of those items is only asking about one thing. Next, we're going to look at a handout that sort of addresses those kinds of survey problems. I've included a handout in this week's module called Example Survey Errors, and it's the very bottom of the module. And it gives you an idea of kind of the problems that one has in survey construction. That sometimes it's a little bit harder to explain. For example, it gives you a double-barreled question. It shows you what reverse coding looks like. So I would take a look at that just so you can get a more richer understanding of those types of errors that can occur. And also I've included an example of conceptual and operational definitions that you can work through if you would like, just as some extra practice for how to do the conversion of making something that's more abstract into something that's measurable. The last thing I want to introduce are these concepts of reliability and validity. So these are measurement questions that we ask of the instruments that we're using and the design that we're using within our studies. And today we're going to talk mostly about reliability, and when we get to experiments, we're going to talk more about validity. Reliability. So reliability, I want you to think of that friend that you know that you can always call whenever you have a problem. That person, no matter what, you've got to move tomorrow, that person's going to be there. So reliability in terms of an instrument is that every single time I use this instrument, I'm going to get basically the same result. So in other words, there's no fluctuation that one might expect based off of like how you're feeling in the moment or whether you've gotten enough sleep. I mean, obviously those are going to make a little bit of difference, but let's assume that I gave you the communication apprehension score again, 2 weeks after you took it. You should basically get the exact same score. So that means it's very reliable. Think of, like a common instrument you might use. So let's say you want to measure an apple. Would the most reliable measurement for an apple be a ruler? You can think about how you would measure the apple. You're going to measure the fat part of the apple. You're going to measure it in the skinny part of the apple. How are you going to know you're measuring it in the same place every time? Versus a tape measure. A tape measure would be a really good way to measure an apple. One, because it's used to measuring things that are not completely flat. So whenever you are engaging in measurement, you want to choose the most appropriate tool to do the measuring, and that's reliability. But just because something is reliable doesn't necessarily mean it's valid. So you could get the same result every single time, but maybe you're not measuring what you think you're measuring. So for example, I want to measure the height of an apple, and I'm using a tape measure to do that, which is perfectly suitable, but I'm really wanting to measure the width of the apple. Or let's say someone wants to measure the diameter of the apple, but instead they're doing the circumference. So validity is the concept that are you measuring what you think you're measuring? For example, if my conceptual definition is learning, how much of the information is in the brain based off of, the end of the semester, are grades a perfectly reasonable measure of learning? Well, let's say I'm talking about the grade on a final exam. Does the final exam really represent everything that you learned that entire semester? Well, gosh, I would hope so, but we could think of an example where it wouldn't. We can think of an all-essay final exam. Well, you learned so much in the semester related to so many things that answering 2 essays may not necessarily, be a good predictor of how much that you learned. So we want to make sure that we're able to say that the instruments that we're using are actually measuring what we think that we're measuring.